All right, guys, a quick reading here of an entry in a Dictionary of Symbols, second edition. I'll show the cover after I finish the reading, but we're going to read, starting here, the entry on loops and bonds. In mythology and iconography, the symbolism of loops and knots has an endless number of variants, both as images of connection and as forms of ornamental art, appearing as plated links, rosettes, knots, or ties, ribbons, cords, or strings, ligaments, nets, and whips. In the broadest sense, loops and knots represent the idea of binding. It would seem that if modern man, according to the existentialist approach, feels himself to be thrown into the world, the primitive Oriental and astrobiological man perceived that he was bound to the world, chained to the world, in other words, to the creator, to the order and society of which he was a part. Georgis Bellatrustis, probably butchered that, in his Etudes sur l'art medieval en Georgie and Arménie, distinguished the following types of rosette in Romanesque ornamentation: intersecting, intertwining, connecting, and linking. He comments that intertwining plates pertain to the most ancient of forms created by man, for they cannot be accounted a product of either barbarian art or of any particular Asiatic influence. Entangled in the knots, nets, or cords, very commonly one finds monsters, animals, or human figures. In the Egyptian system of hieroglyphs, the loop or tie was a sign corresponding to the letter T and equivalent grammatically to the possessive, such as to bind, to dominate, to possess. A related symbol is that of entanglement, but there are particular aspects of this symbol which present it in a favorable light. The golden thread, for example, identical with the silver cord in Hindu tradition and with Orion's thread, and symbolic of the path leading to the creator. The mystic sense comes about by inversion. Instead of the symbol representing external bonds, it comes to stand for inner links. The cordons, which are such a constant feature of heraldry, also pertain to these inner links, sometimes in the form of knots or of ribbons bunched together to form the letter S or the number 8, representing linkage or dependence in the feudal system of hierarchies ratified in the Oath of Allegiance, the maritime hierarchy, the pyramid, or the sublimation of the idea of being in bondage to one's superior, to be a serf or a slave. On the other hand, the external net which envelops and immobilizes should be related in significance to the words of the Bible. It says here, quoted by Pinedo, "Upon the wicked he shall rain snares," and that's cited to be Psalms 11:6. Mircea Eliade has made a special study of the symbolism of knots and ties as they concern the tangle of thread, which has to be unraveled in order to solve the essential basis of a problem. Some gods, such as the Varuna or Uranus, are shown holding a length of rope, signifying their prerogative of supreme power. Eliade notes that there is a symbolic relationship between loops and bonds on the one hand and threads and labyrinths on the other. It says, let me read that again. Eliade notes that there is a symbolic relationship between loops and bonds, and that one hand and threads and labyrinths on the other. On the one hand, and threads and labyrinths on the other. I don't know, maybe I'm not understanding that, but the labyrinths may be regarded as a knot to be untied. Oh, okay, so they complement each other. Yeah, so the labyrinths may be regarded as a knot to be untied, as in the mythic undertakings of Theseus and Alexander. The ultimate aim of mankind is to free himself from bonds. The same thing is to be found in Greek philosophy. In Plato's cave, men are fettered and unable to move. For Plotinus, the soul after its fall is imprisoned and fettered, but when it turns towards the realm of thought, it shakes off its bonds. Eladier has also studied the morphology of bonds and knots in magic cults, distinguishing two broad divisions. The first, those which are beneficent and a protection against wild animals, illness, and sorcery, and against demons and death. And then B, the other, those which are employed as a form of attack against human enemies, symbolically the inverse of severing ropes or bonds. This latter practice is carried to the extent of tying up dead bodies to prevent them from performing the injurious acts which they were supposed to have indulged in. Sometimes symbolic loops and ropes appear in the vegetable form as foliage, which inextricably envelops bodies that fall into it. This is a theme which is related to the symbolism of devouring as well as grotesques. Okay, to add to that, I'm going to read from the same dictionary for thread. According to the Zohar, thread is one of the most ancient of symbols, like hair. It denotes the essential connection between any of the different planes, the spiritual, the biological, social, etc. Okay, then we'll go and we'll read the definition for hair. Hairs in general, hairs represent energy and are related to the symbolism of levels. That is, a head of hair being located on the head stands for higher forces, whereas abundant body hair signifies the prevalence of the baser forces. Sometimes these two meanings have coalesced. On a Romanesque capital in Estebaliz, Adam is depicted beardless before the fall and with long hair and a bushy beard after he has fallen into sin. Hairs also signify fertility. Origen used to say the Nazarites do not cut their hair because all that is done by just men prospers and their leaves to not fall. In Hindu symbolism, hairs, like the threads of a fabric, symbolize the lines of force of the universe. A full head of hair represents élan vital and joie de vivre, linked with the will to succeed. Again, hairs correspond to the element of fire, signifying the burgeoning of primitive forces. A highly important secondary meaning is derived from the color of hair. Brown or black hair reinforces the symbolism of hair in general, that is, dark terrestrial energy. Golden hair is related to the sun's rays and to the whole vast sun symbolism. Copper-colored hair implies a Venusian, of Venus, or demoniacal characteristic. Hairs then come to symbolize the concept of spiritualized energy. Faldor, in his Libro del Oros del Sueño, comments that they quote, represent the spiritual assets of man. Abundant, beautiful hair for both man and woman signifies spiritual development. To lose one's hair signifies failure and poverty. Now, the reverse of loss brought about by forces outside man's control is, in part, willing sacrifice. For this reason, Zimmer points out that all who renounce and defy the principles of procreation and multiplication of life in order to embark upon the path of total ascetism are bound on principle to cut their hair short, such as, perhaps like the military or something. They must simulate the sterility of the aged and hairless who form the last link in the chain of generations. Some religions, as for example that of the ancient Egyptians, used to prescribe total depilation, to remove their hair. Hair, wigs, and beards were used by the Sumerians to ward off evil spirits, as was smoke. Okay, so now we're going to go to the last one I'm going to read to kind of cap this off. Woven fabric. Also remember the goddess Circe, which is the where the word church comes from. You have church, that goes back to Scottish kirk, and that goes back to Circe, C-I-R-C-E. It's also where we get circus, where we get circle, but she was the weaver, the weaver of men's destinies. So if you remember that old song, the wheel in the sky keeps on turning, that would be the wheel in question. So I'll read now. Woven fabric, that being the entry of what I'm reading. The phrase, the web of life, is an eloquent expression of the symbolism of woven fabric, which is not only concerned with ideas of binding and increase through the blending of two elements, the warp and the woof, the passive and the active, nor is it merely equivalent to creation. Rather, does it denote the mystic apprehension of the world of phenomena as a kind of veil, which hides the true and profound from sight. As Porphyry observed, the ancients called the heavens a veil because, in a sense, they are the garments of the gods, and as Plato said, the one and only demiurge commands the secondary demiurges, that is, the mythical gods, to bind the immortal to the mortal in a symbolic fabric. In addition to the symbolism of weaving, this idea embraces that of the Gemini, signifying dual composition of all things in existence, one part being immortal and the other mortal. Plutarch observed that weaving was invented by Isis with the assistance of her sister Nephthys. The legend of the web of Penelope is related to this. Guinan sees the warp and woof as equivalent to the horizontal and vertical limbs of the cosmic cross, where the upright represents the various states of being, and the horizontal the degree of development reached by these states. He also mentions that the two lines of the loom can be identified with the masculine and feminine principles, and that this is why in the Upanishads the supreme Brahma is designated he upon whom the world has, he upon whom the worlds are woven as warp and woof. At the same time, the alternation of life and death, condensation and dissolution, the predominance of yang or of yin are, for the Taoists, like the alternating waves of thread in the weave of the fabric. Apart from this essential symbolism, a fabric has further symbolic meanings deriving from its color, form, and function where applicable. Piab, with particular reference to Scotch tartans, has pointed out that certain types of fabric are characterized by patterns with an esoteric purport. Ornamental designs have the same symbolic significance, whether they appear in a fabric or are engraved on a stone or painted in a miniature. The veil, as an elemental form of weaving and as clothing, is symbolic of wrapping, that is, of matter. The 7 veils in Salome's dress, or in the myth of Ishtar, correspond to the 7 planetary spheres and their respective influences. Okay, yeah, so that was a very interesting background on threads and weaving. This was one of the last things, this, the gist I got from reading these was that this was one of the last things that kind of evolved in the domain of language. Because if you think, you know, when man had no linguistic ability and then he goes to a point where he does have linguistic ability, perhaps one could even argue that that was how you know when man went from unconscious to conscious, or maybe you would even say that was the fall itself, a fall of man, you know, where we ate the forbidden fruit. Okay, and so this was one of the last things to for them to wrap their minds around, to understand this grand cosmic idea of linkage on that small scale, if that makes sense. I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Let me know questions, comments, concerns in the comments. Hit the like button, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one, guys. Take care.